January 17, 1943, Camp Crossville, Tennessee. 2:47 in the morning. The American mess hall stood silent in the winter darkness, its steam vents breathing white clouds into the frozen air. Inside, beneath bare electric bulbs that hummed like distant engines, a German prisoner sat alone at a long wooden table. His hands trembled as they gripped the metal tray. Not from cold, not from fear, but from disbelief. Before him sat scrambled eggs still steaming, 4 strips of bacon glistening with fat, 2 pieces of white bread thick enough to be cake, real butter in a small metal cup, and coffee, actual coffee, with cream and sugar available in glass dispensers on every table. The prisoner's name was Feldwebel Klaus Richter, 23 years old, Afrika Korps veteran. When captured in Tunisia 3 months earlier, he had weighed 58 kilograms. The American doctor who examined him upon arrival had written one word on his medical form: starvation. He lifted the coffee cup. The aroma alone seemed impossible. For 3 years in North Africa, he had drunk Ersatzkaffee, coffee substitute made from roasted acorns, chicory, sometimes burned grain. It tasted like bitterness itself, like the desert, like defeat. This was something else entirely. Dark, rich. When he added cream from the dispenser, watching it swirl into mahogany spirals, his eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. A German soldier did not cry, not over coffee, not over anything. But when he took the first sip, something inside him broke that had nothing to do with bones or flesh. The guard watching from the doorway had seen this reaction before. Every transport brought new prisoners who went through the same sequence: suspicion, confusion, then this strange, silent grief. The guard's name was Corporal James Mitchell from Iowa, where his father grew corn on 300 acres of good black soil. He had learned not to speak during these moments. The prisoners needed time to reconcile what they had been told with what they were experiencing. Nazi propaganda had prepared these men for many things. Interrogation. Torture, perhaps. Forced labor, certainly. Meager rations of bread and water, the absolute minimum required by the Geneva Convention. What Nazi propaganda had not prepared them for was abundance. What it could not explain was a nation so wealthy it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers. The bacon presented its own theological crisis. Richter had not seen meat like this since before the war. Not strips of fat and protein together, but actual meat. In the Afrika Korps, meat had meant occasional horsemeat soup, thin and gray. Sometimes tinned beef from Italy that tasted of rust and chemicals. The Wehrmacht meat ration had been officially 300 grams per week, but that was a number that existed only on paper in Berlin, nowhere else. He ate slowly, trying to make it last, but his body betrayed him. His digestive system, accustomed to sawdust bread and watery soup, revolted against the richness. He made it halfway through the meal before rushing to the latrine, where he vomited violently. When he returned, face pale and sweating, the guard said something in English. Richter understood none of it. But the guard's gesture was clear: sit down, keep eating, this would pass. It did pass. Within 2 weeks, his body adjusted. Within 2 months, he had gained 11 kilograms. Within 6 months, his mother would not recognize him. But that first morning, sitting alone in an American prison camp mess hall at 2:47 a.m. on January 17, 1943, Klaus Richter experienced something that would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any Allied propaganda leaflet. Any radio broadcast, any re-education lecture, he experienced American material abundance as a lived reality, not as an abstraction or a lie or a weakness to be mocked, but as a brown liquid in a white ceramic cup that tasted like the future might not belong to Germany after all. On the table, visible from where he sat, someone had left yesterday's camp newspaper. He could not read the English words, but he understood the advertisement clearly enough. It showed an American soldier in the Pacific, helmet pushed back, drinking from a green glass bottle. The distinctive curved shape was unmistakable even in a black and white photograph. Coca-Cola, 5 cents anywhere in the world, the ad promised. Even here in a prison camp in Tennessee, German prisoners could buy Coca-Cola for 5 cents from the canteen, using scrip earned from work details. Richter had never tasted Coca-Cola. In 1943, most Germans had never even heard of it. It would take another 3 months, another 25 pounds of weight gain, and another catastrophic realization before he would stand in the canteen line, holding his scrip and order his first Coke. When that moment came, when the dark sweet liquid first touched his tongue, he would understand that everything the Reich had taught him about American weakness and decadence had been precisely backwards. The truth was simpler and more terrible. A nation that could afford to give Coca-Cola to its prisoners could afford to win any war. This is the story of how sweetness destroyed certainty, how abundance demolished ideology, and how something as simple as a soft drink in a glass bottle became the most effective weapon America never knew it was deploying. The prisoners arrived throughout 1943 in waves that corresponded to Allied victories. Tunisia in May yielded the bulk of them, 275,000 German and Italian soldiers, the remnants of Rommel's Africa Corps and the Italian First Army, surrounded and starved into submission. Sicily in July and August added tens of thousands more. The Italian campaign that followed sent a steady stream. By December 1943, over 140,000 German prisoners were housed in camps across the continental United States, with more arriving on Liberty ships every week. They came expecting camps like those they had heard about from the Eastern Front, or camps like those Germany itself operated. They came with the certainty that capture meant death or slavery, or at minimum the kind of calculated cruelty that characterized modern war. What they found instead was Crossville and Herne and Aliceville, and 400 other camps that followed, to varying degrees, a set of international rules that Germany had long since abandoned in practice if not in theory. The 1929 Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war receive the same rations as depot troops of the detaining power. For America, this meant that German prisoners ate the same food as American garrison soldiers, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily, including meat, fresh vegetables, dairy products, white bread, real coffee, and unlimited drinking water. The mathematics of this were straightforward and devastating. A German soldier on the Eastern Front in 1943 received approximately 1,800 calories per day when supply lines functioned, considerably less when they did not. A German civilian in a bombed city received approximately 2,000 calories daily, sometimes far less. A German prisoner in American captivity received between 3,000 and 4,000 calories daily, every day, without exception, supplemented by canteen purchases and Red Cross parcels. The implications were inescapable, and they registered in the prisoners' bodies with biological precision. Men who had arrived as walking skeletons gained 20, 30, 40 pounds within months. Their hollow cheeks filled. Their ribs disappeared beneath layers of fat their bodies suddenly had resources to manufacture. Their skin, which had been gray and papery with malnutrition, turned pink and supple. Their eyes, which had been dull with hunger, brightened. In his memoir published 40 years later, Georg Gärtner, who would become famous as Hitler's last soldier in America after escaping in 1945 and living under an assumed identity until 1985, described his first meal in American captivity. We could not believe it. We thought it was a trick, that this food would be taken away after we had tasted it, or that we would be punished for eating it. We ate carefully, waiting for the trap to spring. The trap never came. The food kept coming. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, every day, the same impossible abundance. The abundance was not merely psychological. It was measured, documented, and reported in official medical records that tracked prisoners' health with the same precision that tracked ammunition and fuel. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, which received some of the most severely malnourished Africa Corps prisoners, medical officers recorded average weight gains of 45 pounds over 18 months. Individual cases exceeded this. One prisoner arrived weighing 49 kilograms and departed weighing 82 kilograms, a gain of 33 kilograms or 72 pounds. These transformations happened against a backdrop that made them even more incomprehensible to the prisoners. In 1943, American civilians faced rationing. Sugar, meat, coffee, butter, and cheese were restricted. Families received ration books that limited purchases to ensure fair distribution and to redirect resources to the military. Yet even with rationing, American civilians ate better than most Europeans, and German prisoners eating military rations ate better than American civilians in some respects. The irony was not lost on either Americans or Germans, though for different reasons. Americans, particularly those in agricultural communities that hosted POW camps, sometimes resented that enemy soldiers ate meat while they made do with less. Letters to newspapers complained about the injustice. A farmer in Texas wrote, "My son is fighting in France on K rations while German prisoners in my own county eat steak." The complaint was not inaccurate. The prisoner diet was, by design and by law, generous to the point of seeming wasteful. For the German prisoners, the realization that they were eating better in captivity than they had eaten as soldiers, better than their families were eating in Germany, better than many Americans were eating, produced a cognitive dissonance that bordered on psychological crisis. How could this be? How could the nation Nazi propaganda had portrayed as weak, decadent, racially mixed, and on the verge of collapse afford to feed hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners at a level of abundance that exceeded anything these men had experienced? The answer, of course, was American industrial and agricultural capacity. But understanding this answer required dismantling an entire worldview built on lies about American weakness and German superiority. Into this context came Coca-Cola, both literal and symbolic, both beverage and ideology distilled into bottles green as emeralds and curved like something between a weapon and a promise. The Coca-Cola Company's relationship with the American military predated the war. But in 1941, when America entered the conflict, Coca-Cola President Robert Woodruff made a commitment that would transform the company into a global phenomenon. Every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is and whatever it costs the company. This was not merely marketing. It was logistics on a scale that rivaled military operations. To fulfill this commitment, Coca-Cola would build 64 bottling plants in combat zones around the world, from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. The company would send 148 technical observers, civilian employees in military uniforms, to operate these plants under combat conditions. By war's end, over 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola would be consumed by American military personnel. In addition to countless servings from soda fountains and mobile dispensers, the beverage became synonymous with America itself, with home, with the values soldiers believed they were fighting for. Letters from soldiers to their families frequently mentioned Coca-Cola as a link to normalcy, a reminder that the world they had left still existed. "Had a Coke today," a Marine wrote from Guadalcanal. "First one in 3 months. Tasted like home." But for German prisoners encountering Coca-Cola for the first time in American prison camps, the beverage carried a different symbolic weight. It represented something they had been told did not exist: American abundance as default condition rather than wartime exception. It represented a consumer economy so vast that even non-essential luxuries were treated as rights rather than privileges. Most fundamentally, it represented a democracy that could afford to waste resources on pleasure while simultaneously fighting a two-front war against the Axis. POWs, the camp canteens where prisoners could purchase. Coca-Cola operated on a simple principle. Prisoners who worked received wages, 80 cents per day initially, later raised to $1, paid in scrip that could be used to buy goods from the canteen. The prices were set to match or slightly undercut civilian prices. A Coca-Cola cost 5 cents. A candy bar cost 5 cents. Cigarettes, which were strictly rationed for American civilians, cost 10 cents for a pack of 20. A can of beer, when available, cost 15 cents. At 80 cents per day, a prisoner could afford 16 Coca-Colas or 16 candy bars, or 8 packs of cigarettes or 5 beers, or any combination thereof. This mathematics, the casual mathematics of abundance, struck German prisoners as fundamentally obscene. In Germany, sugar was so scarce that saccharin tablets were used in coffee. Chocolate had disappeared from civilian stores years ago. Cigarettes were currency, more valuable than money in many cases. Beer remained available but was increasingly weak and adulterated. Here, in enemy captivity, all of these things were available for pocket change earned doing farm work or forestry or road maintenance. The psychological impact was profound. Unteroffizier Werner Schmidt, captured at Anzio in January 1944, described his first visit to the camp canteen at Camp Hearn, Texas. "I thought I had died and gone to some strange heaven. The shelves were full, chocolate bars in stacks, Coca-Cola in wooden crates cold from refrigeration, cigarettes in quantities we had not seen in Germany since 1939. I bought one of each thing, just to prove to myself they were real. The Coca-Cola was the strangest. I had never tasted anything like it. Sweet, yes, but also bitter, and it burned slightly in your throat. The bubbles were aggressive. I did not like it at first, but I bought another the next day and another the day after that. Within a week I was drinking 2 per day. It became a ritual, a proof that this impossible situation was real and continuing. The ritual Schmidt described was repeated in camps across America. Prisoners discovered that Coca-Cola was not rationed, not restricted, not reserved for special occasions. It was simply available every day for 5 cents. This availability, this casual, unremarkable availability, conveyed more about American material power than any propaganda lecture ever could. The symbolic weight of Coca-Cola was amplified by the contexts in which prisoners encountered it. At Camp Crossville, prisoners working on local farms during harvest season were sometimes offered Coca-Cola by the farmers employing them. The farmers saw this as simple hospitality, a cold drink on a hot day. The prisoners saw something else. Americans so wealthy they gave Coca-Cola to enemies as a casual gesture, the way one might offer water. On work details, prisoners observed Americans discarding half-empty Coca-Cola bottles because they had grown warm. This waste, this incomprehensible waste, became a frequent topic in letters prisoners sent home, though censors often redacted such passages. One uncensored letter preserved in military archives described a scene at a construction site where American workers and German prisoners labored side by side. The Americans drink Coca-Cola constantly. They open a bottle, drink half, set it down, forget about it, and open another. I watched one man discard 3 half-full bottles in an hour. In Germany, such waste would be criminal. Here it is Tuesday. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity grew sharper as the war progressed. By 1944, when prisoners were writing letters home describing their conditions, their families in Germany were living under increasingly desperate circumstances. Allied bombing had devastated industrial production and transportation networks. The Wehrmacht was in retreat on all fronts, its supply lines stretched to breaking. Civilian rations had been cut repeatedly. The bread ration, which had been relatively stable earlier in the war, was reduced in 1942, 1943, and again in 1944. By late 1944, Germans were eating 20% less bread, 60% less meat, and 35% less fat than in 1943, which had itself represented severe deprivation compared to pre-war standards. Against this background, letters from German prisoners describing meals of meat, white bread, real coffee, and Coca-Cola seemed like fairy tales or lies or some kind of Allied propaganda designed to demoralize the home front. Some families refused to believe them. Others became angry, feeling betrayed that their soldiers were being treated better by enemies than they themselves were being treated by their own government. These emotional responses, denial, and rage indicated that the prisoners' reports were disrupting carefully maintained narratives about the war's progress and Germany's inevitable victory. For the prisoners themselves, the cognitive dissonance between their lived experience and the Nazi worldview became increasingly difficult to sustain. Every meal, every visit to the canteen, every Coca-Cola, every candy bar, every casual interaction with American abundance chipped away at the foundation of beliefs they had carried into war. They had been taught that National Socialism represented the apex of human organization, that the Aryan race's superiority would manifest in material as well as spiritual dominance, that Germany's enemies were degenerate, chaotic, weak. Instead, they found themselves gaining weight while their comrades starved. They found themselves drinking Coca-Cola while their families wrote desperate letters about hunger. They found themselves in a democracy that could afford to be generous to prisoners, while simultaneously producing tanks, planes, ships, and munitions in quantities that made German industrial output look primitive by comparison. The transformation in the prisoners' understanding did not happen uniformly or instantly. Some held fast to Nazi ideology, convincing themselves that American abundance was temporary, illusory, or achieved through Jewish manipulation of global finance. Others underwent rapid conversions, embracing democracy and capitalism with the fervor of true believers discovering a new faith. Most occupied a confused middle ground, trying to reconcile incompatible realities through various forms of psychological compartmentalization. But regardless of their political responses, all prisoners experienced the physical transformation that adequate nutrition produced. They gained weight. Their health improved. Vitamin deficiencies disappeared. Dental problems were treated. Chronic conditions resolved. Within 3 months of arrival, prisoners looked healthier than they had looked in years. Within 6 months, many were unrecognizable compared to their capture photographs. Medical officers documented these changes meticulously. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, Major Robert Harrison conducted a comprehensive study of prisoner health that tracked weight gain, nutritional recovery, and disease resolution across a sample of 1,000 prisoners from the Africa Corps. His findings, published in a military medical journal in 1946, included this observation: the average prisoner gained 27 pounds in the first 3 months of captivity. This gain was not merely weight but represented the restoration of muscle mass, subcutaneous fat, and normal physiological function that malnutrition had compromised. By 6 months, prisoners who had arrived clinically malnourished were indistinguishable from healthy American civilians of similar age and height. Harrison's study also noted something more subtle: the psychological impact of recovering health. Prisoners who arrived sick, weak, and hungry experienced their improving condition as a kind of betrayal. They felt guilty for gaining weight while their comrades still fought. They felt ashamed that captivity had proven more nourishing than service to the fatherland. Some became depressed. Others developed what would later be recognized as a form of survivor's guilt, the most psychologically destabilizing aspect, however, was the realization that American abundance was not aberrant or temporary, but structural and ongoing. It was not a facade maintained to impress prisoners or manipulate them. It was simply how America operated, even under wartime conditions that would have brought any European nation to its knees. This realization often came through small details rather than grand gestures. A prisoner at Camp Como, Mississippi, described watching American guards eat lunch. They had sandwiches thick with meat and cheese. They had apples, fresh apples, in November. They had thermoses of hot coffee. And they had Coca-Cola, of course, always Coca-Cola. What struck me was not that they had these things, but that they seemed bored with them. They ate without appreciation, without gratitude, as if such abundance was their birthright. Which I suppose it was. I realized then that Germany had lost the war before it began. Not because of superior Allied strategy or courage or will, but because we had challenged a nation for whom plenty was normal and scarcity was the aberration. We had mistaken their lack of suffering for weakness. We had not understood that a people who had never known hunger were not soft, but strong in ways we could not comprehend. The symbolism of Coca-Cola crystallized these realizations because the beverage itself embodied the contradictions that troubled prisoners most deeply. It was unnecessary. It provided no essential nutrition. It was, by any reasonable wartime standard, a frivolous luxury. Yet here it was, available in every camp, priced at 5 cents, consumed as casually as water, and treated as an unremarkable element of daily life, rather than as the extraordinary indulgence it would have been anywhere in Europe. Moreover, Coca-Cola was distinctively American in a way that food was not. Bread, meat, coffee, these were universal. But Coca-Cola existed nowhere except where American power had penetrated. The green bottles with their distinctive curves, the red and white logo, the taste itself, sweet and sharp and carbonated and unlike anything in traditional European foodways, all of this marked Coca-Cola as something foreign and specifically American. For Nazi ideology, which defined itself in opposition to American-style democracy and capitalism, the presence of Coca-Cola in the camps was particularly problematic. The beverage represented everything the Reich claimed to oppose: commercial frivolity, consumer capitalism, racial mixing. Coke was marketed to all Americans regardless of race, and the democratization of luxury. Yet prisoners who drank Coca-Cola experienced it not as decadence or corruption, but as a simple pleasure that suggested perhaps the Reich's opposition to such things was not principled but envious. The transformation of prisoners' attitudes toward America was often gradual and incomplete, proceeding through stages of denial, negotiation, and eventual acceptance that did not necessarily imply enthusiasm. A prisoner might acknowledge American material superiority while still believing in German cultural superiority. Another might accept that democracy worked for America while maintaining it was unsuitable for Germany. Still another might embrace American values completely while feeling guilty about the betrayal this represented. But whatever their political evolution, all prisoners confronted the same basic reality. Captivity in America was materially superior to service in the Wehrmacht. This was not supposed to be possible. Every element of Nazi ideology insisted it could not be possible. Yet it manifestly was possible, and the proof was in their own bodies, which had transformed from scarecrows into something approaching normal human shape through the simple mechanism of adequate food, including items like Coca-Cola that had no place in any rational wartime economy but existed anyway because America could afford irrationality as easily as Germany could afford cruelty. The German High Command was aware of how treatment of prisoners in American camps was affecting morale, both among POWs and among soldiers still fighting who heard about conditions through letters or rumors. There were attempts to counteract this through propaganda that portrayed the generous treatment as a trick, a temporary deception that would end once prisoners were no longer useful, or as evidence of American weakness and sentimentality that would ultimately lead to Allied defeat. These propaganda efforts largely failed because they contradicted prisoners' lived experience. A man who had gained 40 pounds on American food, who had access to medical care that had cured his dysentery and scurvy and dental infections, who could buy Coca-Cola and chocolate bars and cigarettes with money earned from light work on American farms, was not easily convinced that his captors were weak or deceptive or doomed to lose the war. More effective, from the Nazi perspective, were efforts to identify and isolate politically unreliable prisoners, those who had become too friendly with Americans, too enthusiastic about democracy, too critical of the Reich. These prisoners were segregated into special camps or sections within camps, away from hardcore Nazis who might re-educate them through violence or threats. The existence of such segregation programs indicated that the Reich understood the ideological threat that American abundance represented. But segregation could not solve the fundamental problem. The problem of the stomach. A prisoner could be isolated from pro-American influences, could be surrounded by fervent Nazis who lectured about racial purity and the Jewish conspiracy and the inevitable triumph of National Socialism. But at mealtime he still ate food that exceeded anything available in Germany. At the canteen he could still buy Coca-Cola for 5 cents. His body still gained weight. His health still improved, and every physical change testified to a truth that no amount of ideological purity could refute. America was winning the war because America had the resources to win the war, resources so vast that they could be extended even to enemies without strain. The repatriation of German prisoners began in earnest in late 1945 and continued through 1946 and into 1947. By then, many prisoners had lived in American camps for 2, 3, even 4 years. They had adapted to abundance. Their bodies had adjusted to 3,000 calories per day. Their minds had grown accustomed to the casual availability of items like Coca-Cola. Their expectations had shifted from scarcity as normal to plenty as normal. Returning to Germany was, in many respects, more traumatic than capture had been. Germany in 1945 and 1946 was a landscape of ruin. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed. The economy had collapsed. Food was so scarce that the official ration in some zones dropped to 1,000 calories per day, less than half what prisoners had been eating in America, less than the minimum required to sustain life for more than a few months without severe health consequences. Prisoners who had gained 40, 50, 60 pounds in American camps lost that weight within months of repatriation. The body they had built on American food could not be sustained on German rations. Medical surveys tracked former prisoners losing 25 to 50 pounds within 6 months of return. This rapid weight loss was not merely cosmetic. It represented the breakdown of muscle mass, the depletion of fat stores, the return of malnutrition diseases like scurvy and beriberi that had been cured in American camps. One former prisoner, Hinrich Weber, described his return to Hamburg. "I came home weighing 84 kilograms. My mother did not recognize me at first. I was fat," she said, almost crying. "I had become American. Within 4 months, I weighed 63 kilograms again. My mother stopped crying then. I looked German again, which is to say I looked hungry. The contrast between American abundance and German starvation radicalized many former prisoners in ways that Nazi ideology never could have predicted. Instead of returning home grateful to be free and ready to rebuild the fatherland, many former prisoners returned home angry, disillusioned, and convinced that the war had been not merely lost, but never winnable, not because of strategic errors or battlefield defeats, but because the fundamental assumptions about American weakness had been catastrophically wrong. Some former prisoners became active proponents of democracy and market capitalism, using their experiences in American camps as evidence that different systems were possible and could produce materially superior outcomes. Others retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to speak about their time in captivity because the contrast between then and now was too painful. A few tried to return to America, legally or otherwise, believing they had no future in Germany's ruins. The symbolic power of Coca-Cola persisted in memory, even when the beverage itself was no longer available. In memoirs and interviews conducted decades later, former prisoners frequently mentioned Coca-Cola as the single item that most embodied American abundance. Not the meat, not the white bread, not even the coffee, though all of these figured in their recollections. But Coca-Cola, unnecessary, frivolous, distinctively American, became the symbol through which they processed their experiences. Georg Gärtner, who lived in America under an assumed identity from 1945 to 1985, described Coca-Cola as the taste of freedom, not because drinking it made him free. He was, after all, an escaped prisoner living in hiding for 40 years, but because it represented a society where freedom was abundant enough to waste on making sweet, fizzy drinks in green glass bottles and selling them for 5 cents to anyone who wanted one, including enemies. Another former prisoner, speaking in a 1970s oral history project, said, "When I think of America, I think of Coca-Cola. I know that's foolish. America is much more than a soft drink. But for me, that drink represented everything we had been told did not exist. Abundance, choice, pleasure for its own sake. The idea that life could be more than suffering and sacrifice. I bought my first Coca-Cola in July 1943 at Camp Hearn. I bought my last Coca-Cola in December 1945 at the Repatriation Center in Liverpool. In between, I probably drank 500 of them. They were all the same. That consistency, that reliability of experience was itself extraordinary. In Germany, nothing was consistent except scarcity. In America, even in a prison camp, even for enemies, abundance was reliable. That reliability shook my faith in everything I had believed about how the world worked. The economic and industrial basis for American abundance during World War II was not mysterious. The United States possessed vast natural resources, advanced industrial infrastructure, protected by ocean barriers from the destruction that ravaged Europe and Asia. American agricultural productivity was extraordinary, capable of feeding not only the American population and military, but also Allied forces and civilian populations in liberated territories. American industrial output exceeded that of all Axis powers combined. In 1943, American factories produced more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. American shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. American farms produced food surpluses even while feeding the largest military mobilization in history. These quantifiable facts explained how America could afford to feed German prisoners 3,000 calories per day while fighting a global war. But for the prisoners themselves, statistics were less persuasive than experience. The experience of drinking Coca-Cola, of eating meals that exceeded any feast they had known in civilian life, of gaining weight in captivity while their countrymen starved. This experience communicated truths that transcended economic analysis. The truth was that abundance could be systematic rather than accidental. That prosperity could be widely distributed rather than hoarded by elites. That democracy, despite its apparent chaos and inefficiency, could produce material outcomes superior to fascist central planning. That individual liberty and collective welfare were not necessarily opposed. That pleasure was not decadent but sustaining. That a nation's strength could be measured in Coca-Cola production as surely as in tank production, because both reflected an industrial capacity that Nazi Germany could not match and could not comprehend. These truths were not explicitly taught. The American military operated re-education programs for German prisoners, but these programs focused on democracy, constitutional government, human rights, and the crimes of the Nazi regime. They did not focus on Coca-Cola or food abundance, because these were not understood as pedagogical tools. They were simply the ambient conditions of American life, extended to prisoners because the Geneva Convention required it, and because America could afford it. Yet these ambient conditions proved more persuasive than any lecture. A prisoner might sit through a re-education session about the evils of totalitarianism and remain unmoved, convinced that the instructor was spouting propaganda. But the same prisoner, drinking his evening Coca-Cola in the camp canteen, confronted evidence that required no interpretation, admitted no debate. The evidence was cold and sweet and carbonated. The evidence was his own body, healthy and well-fed. The evidence was the casual abundance that surrounded him, day after day, without exception, without explanation, without end. The post-war fate of German prisoners who had experienced American abundance took many forms. Some returned to Germany and became leaders in the Reconstruction, bringing with them knowledge of American methods and values. Ludwig Erhard, who would become West Germany's economics minister and chancellor, had spent time in American captivity and credited that experience with shaping his commitment to market economics. Numerous other business and political leaders in post-war Germany were former prisoners who had seen firsthand how capitalism and democracy could produce prosperity. Others immigrated to America legally, using programs designed to attract skilled workers and refugees from Soviet-controlled territory. By the 1960s, tens of thousands of former German prisoners had become American citizens, often settling in the same communities where they had been imprisoned, building lives premised on the abundance they had first encountered as captives. Still others carried the memory of American abundance as a kind of wound, a reminder of what had been lost or what had never truly been possessed. For these men, Coca-Cola became something they could not drink without remembering, could not remember without grieving. The sweetness had curdled into something more complex. Not quite regret, not quite nostalgia, but a recognition that their lives had been shaped by forces they could not control, and that the accident of being captured by Americans, rather than Soviets, had given them experiences and insights that set them apart from those who had not shared them. The larger, historical significance of the Coca-Cola experience extends beyond individual transformations. The German prisoners who encountered American abundance in 1943, 1944, and 1945 became, in aggregate, one of the most effective mechanisms of ideological change that the Allies deployed, though this was never the intention and was barely recognized at the time. These men returned to Germany carrying knowledge that would shape the post-war order. They had seen that democracy worked. They had seen that capitalism produced abundance. They had seen that individual liberty was compatible with social order. They had seen that racial mixing did not produce weakness. They had seen that pleasure was not decadent. They had seen that America was not on the verge of collapse, but was the most powerful nation on earth, and would remain so. This knowledge, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of former prisoners, helped immunize West Germany against Soviet propaganda and facilitated the rapid embrace of Western-style democracy and market economics after 1949. The Marshall Plan provided the capital for German Reconstruction, but former prisoners provided something equally important: first-hand testimony that American systems worked, that abundance was possible, that the future did not have to resemble the ruined present. In this sense, every Coca-Cola drunk by a German prisoner in an American camp in 1943 was a small investment in the post-war order that would emerge. Not because Coca-Cola itself mattered, but because it symbolized and embodied a set of values and capabilities that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War that followed World War II would be fought partly through military means, but more fundamentally through competing visions of how societies should be organized. The Soviet model promised equality through collective ownership and central planning. The American model promised prosperity through individual liberty and market economics. German prisoners who had experienced both scarcity under Nazi central planning and abundance under American capitalism became witnesses in this ideological contest, their testimony weighted by lived experience that permitted no evasion. When a former prisoner in 1950s West Germany told his children that he had drunk Coca-Cola every day in American captivity, that Americans had fed him better than the Wehrmacht had fed its own soldiers, that democracy had proven materially superior to dictatorship. This testimony carried authority that no government propaganda could manufacture. It was not abstract ideology but concrete memory, the taste of sweetness, the feeling of fullness, the experience of health recovered and weight gained and hope kindled in the most unlikely place imaginable, an enemy prison camp where every meal was better than anything available in the supposedly superior Reich. The power of such testimony lay not in its political sophistication, but in its simplicity. A child could understand that food was better than hunger. A grandmother could understand that health was better than sickness. A worker could understand that abundance was better than scarcity. These understandings, multiplied across families and communities, formed the foundation for West Germany's post-war embrace of Western values and systems. The Coca-Cola Company, for its part, recognized the commercial opportunity that the war had created. The 64 bottling plants built to serve military personnel became the foundation for post-war international expansion. By 1960, Coca-Cola was available in nearly every country that was not behind the Iron Curtain. The green bottle with its distinctive curves became one of the most recognizable symbols in the world, synonymous with America and with the promise of prosperity that America represented. In Germany specifically, Coca-Cola became immensely popular in the post-war period, partly because former prisoners introduced it to their families and communities as a beverage they had learned to love in captivity. This created a market that Coca-Cola cultivated aggressively, building bottling plants throughout West Germany and making the beverages available in Hamburg and Munich as it was in New York and Los Angeles. The symbolic weight of Coca-Cola shifted over time. In the 1940s, it represented American abundance and the superiority of democratic capitalism. In the 1950s and 1960s, it became associated with youth culture and modernity. By the 1970s and beyond, it had become so ubiquitous as to lose most of its specific political meaning, becoming simply a soft drink rather than an ideological statement. But for the generation of German prisoners who first encountered Coca-Cola in American camps during World War II, the beverage never lost its original meaning. It remained a symbol of the moment when their worldview collapsed, when certainty gave way to doubt, when hunger gave way to abundance, when everything they had been taught about America and Germany and the nature of power proved to be comprehensively wrong. In the end, the story of German prisoners and Coca-Cola is not really about a beverage at all. It is about the material basis of ideology, about how beliefs are sustained or destroyed by physical experience, about how the simple act of eating and drinking can carry more persuasive force than any argument or propaganda. It is about how abundance, when encountered by those who have known only scarcity, becomes a kind of revelation that reorders understanding at a level deeper than conscious thought. The prisoners who drank Coca-Cola in American camps between 1943 and 1946 experienced something that their training and indoctrination had never prepared them for: the discovery that the enemies they had been taught to despise were capable of generosity, that the system they had been taught to reject was capable of producing prosperity, that the values they had been taught to mock were capable of creating a society where even prisoners could buy sweetness for 5 cents and drink it in peace. This discovery did not make them love America or reject Germany. Human loyalty is more complex than that, but it did make them question. And in questioning, they opened themselves to possibilities that had been foreclosed by Nazi ideology. The possibility that strength and kindness were not opposed, the possibility that abundance and order could coexist, the possibility that the future belonged not to those who best endured suffering, but to those who best created plenty. These possibilities, first encountered in the taste of cold Coca-Cola on a summer afternoon in a Texas prison camp, would shape the remainder of these men's lives, and through them, would shape the remainder of the century, not because Coca-Cola changed them, but because Coca-Cola revealed to them a truth they could not unknow: that the world was larger and stranger and more abundant than their Führer had told them, that their enemies were not weak but strong, and that the war they had fought had been lost not on battlefields, but in factories and farms and bottling plants that produced enough for everyone, even for prisoners who by all rights should have been left to starve. In November 1946, The last major group of German prisoners departed from American camps, bound for Europe and repatriation. Among them was Klaus Richter, who had eaten his first American meal in January 1943 at Camp Crossville. He had spent nearly 4 years in captivity. He had gained 63 pounds. He had learned some English. He had worked on American farms and in American forests, and he had drunk approximately 1,000 bottles of Coca-Cola. On the troop ship carrying him back across the Atlantic, Richter stood on deck watching the American coastline recede. He held in his hand the last bottle of Coca-Cola he would drink for 12 years, purchased from the ship's canteen with the last of his scrip. The bottle was warm. The ocean was cold. The future was uncertain. He drank slowly, trying to remember the taste, knowing he would need this memory in the difficult years ahead. Sweet, sharp, carbonated, American. This simple combination had taught him more about power and ideology in the future than any lecture or battle ever could. When the bottle was empty, he did not throw it overboard. He kept it, carrying it through the repatriation processing center, carrying it on the train to Hamburg, carrying it home to his mother's bombed-out apartment where she wept to see him so fat and American-looking. He kept the bottle on a shelf for decades, an empty green glass curve that meant nothing to anyone but him. It meant this: that abundance was real, that the Reich had lied, that suffering was not noble, that pleasure was not weakness, that America had won not because it was harder or crueler or more willing to sacrifice, but because it was richer and freer and more generous, even to its enemies, even when it did not have to be. Years later, when his grandchildren asked about the old Coca-Cola bottle on the shelf, Richter would tell them this story. He would describe the impossible meals, the weight he gained, the health he recovered. He would describe the camps where prisoners lived better than soldiers. He would describe the abundance that had no precedent in his experience and had seemed at first like a hallucination or a trick, and he would tell them this: that the bottle was proof. Proof that he had not imagined it. Proof that such abundance had existed and might exist again. Proof that the world contained possibilities beyond suffering, beyond sacrifice, beyond the narrow certainties that had led Germany into catastrophe. The bottle was green and empty and old, but it had once been full of sweetness, and that sweetness, encountered by a starving soldier in an enemy prison camp in Tennessee in 1943, had changed everything. This is the truth that Coca-Cola taught, the truth that American abundance demonstrated, the truth that no propaganda could convey and no ideology could refute, that freedom and prosperity were not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths to be reckoned with, and that a nation confident enough to give Coca-Cola to its prisoners was a nation that would shape the future of the world.